Hi class, welcome to the Process and Behavioral Addictions. This is Dr. Heather Austin Robillard, and in this lecture I'll be talking a little bit about how behavioral addictions are typically seen as controversial in the mental health field and have long been debated whether these specific behaviors are actually addictions or addictive behaviors, or are they more of an impulse-compulse behavioral mental health disorder. So before we move into the lecture information, I'd like you to think about a few questions. What critiques have you read of diagnosing or labeling a behavior as an addiction? What evidence do you know that exists that the diagnosis of a process or behavior is an addiction? There are some researchers and clinicians in the addiction field that believe that the term addiction should only be used or applied to circumstances where there is chemical substances. But there are other researchers and clinicians that stress the need to understand addiction in a broader context. Those who view addiction in a broader context consider using the same criteria for chemical addictions diagnoses as they do for behavioral addictions. Those who argue against process or behavioral addictions being considered an addiction often state that these behaviors are better understood as being either an obsessive compulsive disorder or an impulse control disorder. Let's look at the case for why the process addictions could be considered an addictive disorder. Individuals engage in compulsive behaviors for very similar reasons that they engage in compulsive substance use. The hallmark or symptoms of chemical addictions are also observed in process addictions. If you remember what those hallmarks are for chemical addictions, those are compulsion, tolerance, withdrawal, abuse, denial, relapse. Process addictions are triggered by the same factors as someone who develops a chemical addiction: genetic, environmental, repetition of the behavior. Process addictions also alter brain chemistry in the same way that chemical addictions can. The overriding illness is an addiction, which involves lack of control over the behavior. An important part about what proves that chemical addictions are a disease and an actual addiction is the genetic environment factors. So as we mentioned in the last slide, genetics and the environment both play a role in process addictions, just like chemical addictions. This slide specifically highlights some of those genetic environmental links that have been found in the research on many different types of process addictions. So there was a study done on twins looking at compulsive gambling. 50 to 60% of the propensity for them to be compulsive gambling had to do with their genetics, similar to what we find in the chemical genetic predisposition. Another one was obesity and compulsive overeating has been shown to have a high genetic component. Genes have been identified as having a susceptibility to addictions, chemical and behavioral. And researchers think that people with certain genes might have less dopamine receptors than normal. Therefore, they seek out situations that release excess dopamine. Then there's also the environmental factors that are similar in the research that shows that there's access to situations that encourage addictive behaviors. Example of those would be parties for young adolescents that idolize promiscuous sex. Other environmental factors that are common among people who struggle with a behavioral addiction are history of abuse, history of mood disorders. We've heard the adage that almost all addicts I've talked to said that they've had a background in which they felt inferior, inadequate, guilty, ashamed, rejected, and unwanted. No matter what I did, it was never enough. So they have this history of not feeling like enough and needing to cope with this pain through a behavior. We will now move into discussing compulsivity and impulsivity in more broad terms, and you will learn how both compulsivity and impulsivity relate to addictive disorders, but not perfectly explain addiction in a way that makes impulse control disorder or obsessive compulsive disorder the best diagnostic category for addiction. Process addictions are repetitive. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Health Disorders, or the DSM, is a text created by the APA to aid clinicians and physicians in diagnosing clients with mental health issues such as depression and addictive disorders. In the DSM, skin picking, or the impulsive need to pick at your skin repeatedly, is an example of an impulse control disorder. Impulse control disorders are characterized by an individual's inability to resist the urge to do something harmful to themselves or to others, harm being the key. A commonly known example of an impulse control disorder is kleptomania, or the impulse to steal. These individuals feel an increasing sense or tension of arousal before engaging in these acts that characterize the disorder, such as fire setting, like pyromania. During the act, the individual may feel pleasure, but once the act is completed, the individual typically feels regret and guilt. Eating disorders and gambling and other process addictions share some signs of impulsivity. Impulsivity and compulsivity are natural behaviors controlled by brain mechanisms that are essential for survival. Compulsiveness is related to the increased frontal lobe activity, and impulsivity is related to the decreased frontal lobe activity, stress. Pathological impulsivity and compulsivity characterize a broad range of mental disorders, but behaviorally, they are at the core most debilitating symptoms in the disorders in which they occur. Let's look at the comparison to the two. Impulsivity is a choice, and it is a steeper reward discounting. The individual has a delayed aversion. There's a lack of consideration when making decisions. There is a change in the response of their situation, or in their response criterion, and there is timing impairment. Overall, an individual suffering from impulsivity's actions are poorly conceived, prematurely expressed, unduly risky, or inappropriate to the situation, and they often result in an undesirable consequence. In compulsivity, these individuals have rigid strategies or attention sets. They are often inappropriate persistence of habits despite negative consequences. These individuals' actions persist despite the actions being inappropriate in the context of their situation, and the actions have no obvious relationship to the overall goal. And often this results in undesirable consequences. Examples of compulsive disorders include schizophrenia, autism, obsessive compulsive disorder. The diagram also highlights the overlap between the two terms, in that there is a motor disinhibition and impaired ability to stop a response or sequence. A helpful tip is to think of the terms as having a relationship that lies on a spectrum, with impulsive on one end and compulsive on the other end. These terms relate to the process addictions because some researchers and clinicians have argued that process addictions are either a type of impulsivity or compulsivity, and I'll stress to you that all of this is too simplistic of a way to understand process addictions. An individual with process addiction could have a mixture of symptoms related to both impulsivity and compulsivity, depending on the specific behavioral addiction. One definition of impulse behavior is a predisposition towards rapid, unplanned reactions to internal and external stimuli, without the regard of negative consequences of these actions to the impulse individual or others. Impulsivity is not always unplanned. Some pathological gamblers plan in advance to pursue their impulsive behavior. Impulsive behaviors can be conceptualized as the core symptom of a broad range of psychiatric disorders that are often comorbid or co-occurring with one another. The takeaway point from the impulse behaviors is that process addictions will have signs of impulsivity or impulsive behaviors, but what characterizes someone as having an impulse control disorder is 1, it hurts themselves or others, and 2, the impulse control behavior is the main characteristic of the individual's symptoms. For process addictions, though, not all process addiction behaviors hurt self or others, at least not initially. Gambling, the first few times engaged in, may not hurt self or others, whereas compare this to pyromania, the act of setting destructive fires has a great potential for harm. Again, with process addictions, The underlying main concern for this individual is the addictive nature of the behavior, not just the presence of impulsivity. Now, with compulsive behaviors, compulsivity refers to repetitive behaviors that are performed according to certain rules or in a stereotypical fashion. Compulsivity has a tendency to repeat the same, often purposeless act, which are sometimes associated with undesirable consequences. Impulsivity and compulsivity may be viewed as diametrically opposed or alternatively as similar in that each implies a dysfunction of impulse control. Each involves alterations with wide range of neural processes, including, for example, attention perception and coordination of motor and cognitive response. Process addiction and obsessive compulsive disorders both include the presence of intrusive thoughts, compulsive behavior patterns, and attempts to eliminate or control the thoughts and behaviors. The difference, though, between the two occurs in whereas addictive behaviors are often utilized to reduce anxiety and other painful effects, they also produce pleasure and gratification when they're engaged. The presence of pleasure and gratification is what rules out a diagnosis of compulsion, as compulsion should not have any gratifying outcome. Process addiction behaviors such as gambling, having sex, and eating can be compulsively engaged in, but the individual engaging in these compulsive behaviors typically feels a sense of pleasure, but usually wants to resist the behavior due to the negative outcomes that tend to follow the behavior. So, what is a behavioral addiction? How do we define it? Behavioral addictions for addiction treatment professionals, the book basically defines it as the relentless pursuit of a sensation or activity despite the consequences of one's health and well-being. See how this can be similar to chemical addiction. If we go back to the disease argument, this behavior can also trick our brains into thinking that we want to participate in this behavior purely for survival. So sex is no longer just sex. Sex is survival. And they continue to participate in those behaviors despite their negative consequences. These consequences can be similar to chemical addictions like health reasons, relationships, legal and financial. The book also talks about how the ASM identifies criterion for addiction and specifically for how behavioral addictions fit into those criteria. One being they have impaired control, they cause cognitive changes, and they also have emotional changes involved with them. Now, it is important to establish a diagnosable criteria and definition for process addictions that includes it being an actual addictive disorder, as it would create a common clinical language. It would give a legitimization of process addiction disorders for third-party reimbursement and a step towards standardized treatment protocol. Currently, there is potential for an individual with a behavioral addiction to be misdiagnosed with an impulse control disorder or obsessive compulsive disorder. There also exists a high comorbidity rate between chemical and process addictions, and overlooking the process addictions or viewing it as an impulse or compulsive disorder could lead to overlooking the chemical addiction. Types of process addictions include pathological gambling, disordered eating, food addiction, sexual and pornography addiction, internet and TV addiction, gaming, and shopping. The ones starred currently are the only ones recognized in the DSM-5. However, remember that the DSM-5 recognizes some of these as impulse-compulsive disorder, like disordered eating and self-injury. They recognize as impulse and compulsive disorders, whereas pathological gambling is one of the only ones that they recognize as an actual addictive disorder that's not chemical.